Hello and welcome everyone. So this is lecture 4 in which we look at the scientific revolution and in particular look at Copernicus. We'll also talk a little bit about Hans Holbein and his painting, looking at his works as they relate to the Renaissance. So the question I want to start you all off with is this one. How has Nicholas Copernicus changed the way that we imagine the universe? How has he changed our very understanding, the way that we think, that we picture, that we imagine the universe to be? All right, so let's go ahead, let's get into it. The plan for today, I want to start by talking about, pick up where we left off with the Protestant Reformation. We talked about Luther at the very beginning of this, looking at Luther as the catalyst for the Protestant Reformation. I want to look and talk a little bit about where it goes after that. Then I do want to look at this term, the Renaissance, looking at this time period, looking at what it means, looking at how things change. Then look at Hans Holbein in particular and look at his great work, The Ambassadors, which I'm excited to talk about with you all. After that, in part 2, we will look a little bit at the history of astronomy. Then we will focus in on Nicholas Copernicus, looking at the way that he changed, as I mentioned at the beginning, our very understanding of the cosmos, a very understanding of the universe. Then finally, we'll look at his great work, The Revolutions of the Celestial Orbs, and really just highlight a few of the key ideas, a few of the main ideas that I really think you should come away with. Okay, let's go ahead and let's get into it. Part 1. So a few key terms for you all as we get started here. The first one here is an epicycle. This is a small circle whose center moves around the circumference of a larger one. So if you think basically you have, imagine a sphere with something, a small circle, a sphere, with a planet with a body moving around the outside. You have another sphere, another circle going around that body as well. Okay, the next term here is geocentric. This is having or representing the Earth at the center. The inverse of this, or something, the opposite of this, I suppose you could say, is heliocentric. This is having or representing the sun at the center. The next term here is parallax. This is the effect whereby the position or direction of an object appears to be different when viewed from different positions. So one really easy example of this, one way you can see this, is if you hold your finger out in front of you and you close one eye and then you close the other eye, it will appear to have moved. And this is simply because the position from which you're looking at the object, in this case your finger, is slightly different. So it looks as though it's in a slightly different location. And this has to do with the way that people thought about the stars and thought about our location in relation to the stars. Okay, so before we get to any of that though, I do want to pick up where we left off last time with the Protestant Reformation. We talked about Martin Luther, who's, as I mentioned, in many ways the beginning of this process. And the big event here is that he nails his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg in 1517. In doing so, eventually he leaves his break with Rome. He becomes the founder of what's known as Lutheranism, his own way of understanding religion, his own way of understanding Christianity. Some of the things we see with Lutheranism is, first of all, this real focus on the individual and on human agency. And very quickly we see this new religion, this new way of thinking about religion being embraced in many territories within the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, I mentioned it's a lot of small principalities. We also see it embraced in Scandinavia and also in the Baltics. We see all these regions breaking away from Roman Catholicism. The next major figure here is John Calvin. He's a contemporary of Luther's, and he builds upon these earlier Protestant ideas. And this begins to develop around 1519. So this is beginning around the same time as Luther, so a little bit after what we see happening in Wittenberg in 1517. It actually begins before the Council of Worms, where we see Luther making his main break with Rome. Anyways, we see Calvin developing his ideas in Switzerland. And he does develop this theocratic regime, so this regime that mixes secular power, the power of the state, with spiritual power, the power of these religious ideas as well. And so we see him developing this in Geneva around 1541. And then we do see Calvinism spreading throughout Europe. So it begins in Switzerland, it spreads to places like Italy, France. It becomes a big deal in France. Although France remains a Catholic country, we still do see the significant Protestant minority develop. All right, and the last major figure here is Henry VIII. And it's Henry VIII who's the ruler of England, who breaks with the Roman Catholic Church, he establishes the Church of England. And one big reason for this, as I mentioned in a previous lecture, is he did want to divorce his wife. He wanted to have a son, he wanted an heir, and so he wanted to divorce his wife. The Pope wouldn't allow it. The Pope wouldn't grant him an annulment. And so this is one factor, and then we do see him wanting more religious freedom, more control over his country as well. And it does lead him to establish his own church, the Church of England, in 1534. Okay, so what we see happening then around Europe, we have all these different territories that are either becoming Protestant, embracing Protestantism, or they're maintaining their Catholic identity. And often this is a very torturous, a very fraught process. And so we see a great deal of conflict happening in this period. At the same time, due to these complaints, due to the arguments that we see these Protestant thinkers articulating, we do see the Catholic Church attempt to reform itself as well. And so a big aspect here is the big reform movement here is known as the Counter-Reformation. And this really takes place between 1543 and 1563. We do see this real emphasis on reform within the church. We see the Catholic Church ending some of the abuses. So things like indulgences, for instance, begin not to be used anymore, which is probably for the best. And then we do see these new religious orders developing as well. So the Jesuits, for instance, develop during this period. They saw themselves as soldiers really serving the Pope directly. And so they go out and serve the Catholic Church and serve the Pope's will. At the same time, we see a lot of institutions developing that are really focusing on purity, really focusing on purifying the church as much as possible. And so we do see a number of Catholic institutions being founded during this period. They're stressing religious purity, national unity, and also control over Christian doctrine. The most famous of these is, the Spanish Inquisition is founded a little bit before this, but we start seeing the Spanish Inquisition being used to embrace these ideas, being used as a means of really stressing religious purity and national unity through this religious purity as well. I mentioned conflict a second ago. We do see a number of wars of religion happening during this period. For instance, we see wars in Italy from between 1494 and 1559. A lot of these start playing into this relationship between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope. We see this competition over power. We also get the Dutch revolts against Spain, which ends up lasting about 80 years, more or less. This is a long conflict, although ultimately the Netherlands would gain their independence. But this conflict takes place between about 1568 and 1648. Then finally, the big war, the major religious war we see breaking out in Europe is the 30 Years' War between 1618 and 1648. It's been estimated that around 7 million people died in this conflict, and it's massive. So it begins in Germany, it begins in the Holy Roman Empire, and we see fighting over whether these states could be Protestant or whether we would see these outside rulers coming in and imposing Catholicism upon them. And so we see a number of wars beginning there, but then really going and really spreading throughout Europe as well. This war culminates, it ends in the Treaty of Westphalia, which I want to highlight, mainly because this gives us this really comes to define a lot of European nations. So this is where we see the final boundaries of places like France, Sweden, Austria-Hungary. All these places are being defined, what they have, what they are, Prussia as well, through this treaty, which really comes to define and really comes to set the European map as well. Okay, so let's talk about the Renaissance. The Renaissance, this is a huge topic. One thing that I think would be nice actually for you all to start is just with this video. So I would ask you either to stop this video now and go watch that one and then come back, or once you're done with this video, just to go ahead and to go onto the PowerPoint and watch this video up to the 8-minute mark, more or less. And it does give you a basic breakdown of the Renaissance, what it is, and so on. Just to give a few major points here, a few bullet points. So we see the Renaissance. So first of all, the term Renaissance itself signifies rebirth. It's this idea of this rebirth of knowledge, this rebirth of the human, this rebirth of the individual, this idea of coming back to these classical ideas that we saw developed in the classical world, but now being embraced by these new Renaissance states, these new Renaissance cultural centers. We do see the Renaissance, as we think of it today, beginning to develop in Italy and then spreading throughout Europe. We see this general flourishing of art, culture, and ideas taking place. This coincides with what's known as this rediscovery of Greek and Roman ideas. A lot of Roman texts never left, but a lot of Greek philosophy actually comes back into Europe during this period. Interestingly, a lot of this is coming back through the Islamic world. So places like the Abbasid Caliphate had actually made this major translation emphasis, this real emphasis on translating the classics, either the Greek classics. They also translated texts from India and China. But what we see happening is a lot of these Greek texts being translated into Arabic. And then during this period, and for a few centuries before this as well, being retranslated or being translated into Latin from Arabic as this way. So we see this interesting path that a lot of very famous Greek philosophers, Greek thinkers go on. So people like Aristotle, for instance, are lost to Europe for a long time, for centuries, and then they're only really rediscovered as they're being translated from Arabic into Latin. So it's a really interesting process. But we do see these new ideas, these new theories, these new ways of looking at the world really coming to shape the culture of the period. At the same time, we see major advancements in the arts. We see this in the visual arts. This is a period of people like Da Vinci, who you see one of his sketches here on the right, a famous sketch. Also individuals like Michelangelo, Titian. Also major advancements in literature, so figures like Machiavelli, Rabelais, and so on. And so at the same time, really dovetailing with this as well, is we do see the spread of literacy and new ideas. So a lot of this has to do with the printing press as well. We talked a little bit about the impact of the printing press on the spread of literacy. This idea that books are not just for the wealthy, not just for the elites. It's not just the upper nobility and the clergy who can read and write and consume these works, but we start seeing really middle-class individuals being able to read and being able to afford to buy books for the first time as well. And this really changes the intellectual landscape of Europe during this period. At the same time, we do see the rise of humanism, so this focus on the individual and on human agency. We also see the rediscovery of classical texts and ideas, as I mentioned before, and also this idea that man's fate is determined by man himself. So here we see this idea that the individual is the one shaping affairs. It's not, everything's not just God's will. Instead, what we see is that individuals are able to shape the world around them in meaningful ways. We see this playing out in things like history writing as well. So what we see is humanist historians looking at the past not as this account, not as this revelation of God's divine will, but instead as an account of what people were able to do and how people were able to shape the world around them. Okay, so one of the big artistic figures of this period of the Renaissance is Hans Holbein. He's born in Germany. He is known as Hans Holbein the Younger because his father was Hans Holbein the Elder. He ends up traveling to England and working at the court of Henry VIII, following the spread of Protestantism in Switzerland. He works for Thomas More, then he works for Henry VIII. Henry VIII actually executed Sir Thomas More, which is another story, a story for another day. But Holbein ends up painting a series of portraits for the Tudor court. He does unfortunately end up dying of plague in London. One of his great works is The Ambassadors. We see this depiction of two French ambassadors at court. And this is part of a long tradition of depicting wealthy individuals with scientific instruments. You can see the painting here. You can see these scientific instruments here in the background as well. So you have things like the globe. You see different scientific instruments there. Musical instruments, you see musical instruments here in this book as well. But different kind of, this combination of different elements that makes one a high class, high status individual during this period. Okay, so some discussion questions for you all. First, why did Holbein include globes, musical instruments, and other scientific devices in the painting? You can see them here. One thing that I would like to stress is we see science being embraced by the elite. Science is a mark of being elite, being amongst the wealthy and the powerful. During the Renaissance, we see this embrace of knowledge. And so we can see by highlighting these scientific devices, these two individuals are showing how educated, how elite they are as well. They're members of this new elite that's marked not only by status, not only by wealth, but also by access to scientific knowledge, also by the ability to be able to read these devices and understand the most recent technological advances, most recent scientific advancements as well. Okay, so what does this reveal about the role of science technology in that society? We see it really being embraced. I mean, we see science here as a mark of status, which is something that is kind of incredible. But also this idea that the world is changing. And we see this Renaissance idea that what we as humans can do through our intellect is really come to understand the world around us. It's not just about accepting received information. We'll talk about the Enlightenment in a little bit, in a few weeks, but we see here this proto-Enlightenment idea that all we need to understand is reason. And what we do is not just accept the information that we've been given, but we actually have to challenge it. We actually have to question it, have to really engage with it in a meaningful way. And so here we see science being this marker of status and this really occupying this privileged role in society. Question 3, one of my favorite questions. Do you see it? You see, if you look in the painting here, down at the bottom, what might look like driftwood. This is actually a skull. So if you go down to the right, so if you, even on your computer screen, if you go lower right and you look at it, you'll see that this is a skull that Holbein has embedded into his painting, that he's hidden in plain sight. So we see here in the midst of this scientific ideal, in the midst of this very deluxe, very luxurious scene, we see Holbein at the same time that he's depicting these two young noblemen in all their power and wealth and splendor. He's still embedding this idea of death into the foreground. He's still embedding this idea that despite technology, despite wealth, despite riches, we still have to die. And there's still this issue, this problem that has to be confronted, that has to be engaged with. So question 4, does it change the way that you interpret the painting? I think it has to. We have here this image that's hidden in plain sight that's dominating the painting in a way and really forces us to think not just about the nobles at this moment with their scientific devices, but also the idea that all of science, all of knowledge can't help you when it comes to death. It can't help you as you have to face this fact of life, the fact that life will end, the fact that we are doomed to die as well. Okay, oops. Last question here. What is the main theme of the painting? I mean, I think I would build off that one, this idea that we see science being celebrated, we see these nobles being celebrated, but at the same time, despite all of this, all this wealth, all this splendor, all this scientific knowledge, despite this musical knowledge, there's still the fact of death. And this is still something that is impossible to overcome. This painting has actually been cropped a little bit, unfortunately, which I didn't realize until just now. But if you look at the original, there is a crucifix in the back corner just behind the curtain. And so I think here this speaks to this general theme that we see God in a sense has been put in the background, but he's still central. He's still, these religion and God, religion's able to answer these questions that mankind, for all of one's scientific knowledge, is unable to confront on one's own. So, okay, cool. So to recap, we talked about the Protestant Reformation. We talked about the Catholic Counter-Reformation. We began discussing the Renaissance, and we looked at Hans Holbein as well. So let's go ahead and let's get into part 2. And we begin with a general, very, very brief history of astronomy. So in antiquity, we have a lot of these ideas developing. We see this belief that the Earth is a sphere that was circled by 7 planets: the Moon, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. You can see a bit of this design here, and you have the stars here in the background as well. It is worth noting, well, first of all, before we move too far on, just this idea that the Earth as a sphere is an idea that's around for millennia, usually. Millennia, actually. So we do see this idea long before Columbus, long before many educated individuals knew the world was, in fact, a sphere. Some thinkers took this even further. So Aristarchus of Samos, for instance, and also Seleucus of Seleucia, both argued for a heliocentric universe. They also argued that the universe was infinite, which is really, I mean, it's just very, it's a very intelligent, very clever reading that we do see very, very early. Okay. So, well, I was going to say, unfortunately, in some ways, the theory from antiquity that becomes predominant in the Middle Ages is the one articulated by Claudius Ptolemy, who's a Greek and Roman astronomer, mathematician, and geographer. And we see Ptolemy arguing for a geocentric system of the universe. So arguing for an idea of the universe that places the Earth at its center. One reason he did this is because he was unable to measure stellar parallax. And because he was unable to measure this, he argued that the stars were not moving, the Earth was not moving, everything was solid, everything was stuck in place. So he concluded that the Earth must not be moving. But what's really amazing about the system is he was able to predict the movement of the heavens. And the way he did this was through very, very close, very detailed study of the movements of the planets and then working backwards to find a system that worked. So basically he was retrofitting his system to match what he saw as opposed to looking and seeing and coming up with a system, or really kind of coming up with a theory and then proving it through observation. He's beginning with observation and then going backwards to come up with a theory that fits that observation. Unfortunately, his system is very, very complex. So it's used for centuries, but it is this very complicated system that does rely on these epicycles as well. So he had circles on top of circles, epicycles on top of epicycles, and he comes up with a working system that you can use to predict movement because he's seen it before. He's seen this movement in the heavens before, but at the same time, it's something that is incredibly inelegant. It's something that is incredibly complex. And this is something that we see Copernicus is going to be reacting against. However, we do see this idea and Ptolemy's ideas in general shaping or helping to shape the medieval worldview. And we talked a little bit about this already, but we do see medieval thinkers and scholars embracing the Ptolemaic system. They embrace this idea that the universe was already fully known by the ancient Greeks and Romans, especially Aristotle, so what they knew of him. And this was reinforced by the church and by universities. We also see the development of these rigid, divinely mandated social hierarchies. There was this idea that the social hierarchies on earth would match those in heaven. They're a reflection of these divine hierarchies, and they're eternal, right? So this idea that things are static and hierarchical, but this idea that the earth itself is static and all these social systems that are set in place are also static as well. So what we also see in the Middle Ages is this idea of two types of matter. So you have this heavenly matter that was eternal, and then this earthly matter that was corrupt. So you get this fundamental difference between the things of this earth, the things of our world, the things of man, and the things of the heavens, which are internal, incorruptible, and this idea that it's, well, I mean, we see here, it's this idea of time being fundamentally simultaneously. So everything is taking place at once in the face of eternity and of God, and everything is outside of time. So God himself is outside of time. You can see a little bit here, right? So we see this divine figure and we see the earth here underneath, but this idea that everything is frozen in a sense. And we do see the creator, we see God being outside of temporality, being outside of any type of movement, either of time or of matter as well. And so Copernicus is really one of the big figures in changing all of this. He plays this fundamental role in changing the way that we think about the heavens, changing the way that we think about the cosmos. So who was Copernicus? So Copernicus was a Polish priest, and he studied in Italy for a while. He was exposed to Aristarchus, and this is one of the figures we believe who really shaped his thinking. He may have also been influenced by Islamic mathematicians who were also coming up with this idea of a heliocentric cosmos during this period, a heliocentric galaxy. He does come up with these ideas of different motions of the Earth. So this motion of a revolution and a rotation as well. So rotation around the sun and the Earth is revolving at the same time. Copernicus did believe, so before this we see this idea so with Copernicus we see this idea of the universe consisting of these 8 fixed spheres where we see the planets in motion around the sun but in a fixed course. and in a fixed course that goes around in a circular motion, goes along as a sphere. And so Copernicus lays out his theory that planets, including the Earth, rotated around the sun, but the moon did revolve around the Earth, which of course, as we know, is correct. And then the Earth is just another planet with a 24-hour rotation. So yeah, so basically the Earth is not unique, it's not the center, it's not static, it's moving like all these other planets around the sun. He lays this out in his great work, in the Revolution of the Celestial Orbs. He probably began this in about 1514, although he doesn't actually publish it until shortly before his death in 1543. The work is dedicated to the Pope. I mean, he was a Catholic priest. And it does have 6 books, much like Ptolemy. So we do see echoes of Ptolemy, and we see Copernicus embracing the same structure as a means of laying out his own theories as well. So the main arguments that Ptolemy lays out, first of all, this idea of the universe itself being a sphere. He believed that spheres were this sacred shape. They were the perfect shape. Also this idea that the Earth is a sphere as well, and then that there is a heliocentric universe. This is his big idea. You can see it here in this image on the right, the sun's in the middle, and the different planets going around it. So Mars, Venus, the Earth, Mercury, Venus, the Earth, and Mars, and so on. He also laid out this idea that the Earth is in motion, which is something that was not at all believed at the time, and this idea of this triple motion of the Earth. So first of all, the rotation of the Earth, so days and nights, this rotation around the sun. So we see here the development of years, and then also he argued for an annual tilting of the Earth's axis, which is incorrect. He was trying to explain some of these other geological factors. Okay, so a few discussion questions for you all. First, why does Copernicus think that the universe and the world are spheres? I mean, a big part of this is that he thought the sphere was the perfect shape. So it made sense for the universe to be simple. It made sense for the universe to be perfect. And so since this is the perfect shape, it made sense that these would be the shape that God would choose, excuse me, would be the shape that God would choose to lay out the universe. So the universe itself was in these spherical, where it was built out of these spheres. Okay, how does Copernicus argue that the Earth is not in the center of the universe? I have a short passage here. Copernicus writes, "Hence, I feel no shame in asserting that the moon and the Earth traverse a grand circle amid the rest of the planets in an annual revolution around the sun. Moreover, since the sun remains stationary, whatever appears as a motion of the sun is really due rather to the motion of the Earth. This should be admitted, I believe, in preference to perplexing the mind with an almost infinite multitude of spheres, as must be done by those astronomers who try to fix the Earth in the middle of the universe. On the contrary, we should rather heed the wisdom of nature, which especially avoids producing anything superfluous or useless, and frequently endows a single thing with many effects." So here, one of the main arguments is simply this idea that the sun is in the center, and it's just making it a simpler way of understanding it. So he goes to this idea that one of the things that's more perfect is something that's easier to understand, something that is simpler. And so this idea that he's going away from this epicycle system embraced by Ptolemy for what he perceives to be a simpler system. Although actually to make the math work on the spheres, which as you all I'm sure know, the planets don't go around in spherical orbits, they go around the sun in elliptical orbits. And to make the math work, he actually has to bring in all these epicycles as well. So his system that he's arguing for simplicity is actually not really all that simple. This is his big argument for why the sun should be in the center of the universe. Okay, so number 3, why would Copernicus's theory have presented such a challenge to the church? What does it do? How does it change about the way that we think about the universe? The big one here is that it goes against what the church had been teaching for centuries. And it goes against the church had embraced this Ptolemaic system. There are also some short passages in the Bible that talk about God stopping the sun in the sky. And so by going against this theory, what we see Copernicus doing is he's chipping away, in a sense, with this received authority of the church. And he's going towards this idea, this humanistic idea that we should figure things out for ourselves, we should test and observe, and we should do experiments, and we should come to our own conclusions. And the conclusions that Copernicus is coming to here is that it's not the Earth at the center of the universe or the solar system, instead it is the sun. And this is a major change in the way that we're thinking. Also, what does it do? It changes our place in the universe as well. So in this traditional system that we see laid out in, or at least supported early on by the Catholic Church, we see this idea that the Earth is the center of God's creation. God created them special. God created us special. And what Copernicus is doing is he's decentering humanity in the universe. We're no longer at the center of the universe. We're no longer special in this way. Instead, we're just one more planet that is revolving around the sun. This fundamentally shapes and shifts and changes the way that we have to think about ourselves. All right, folks, that's it. So don't know what's going on here. So just to, oh, sorry, I have a couple more things. So first, a few problems with Copernicus. First of all, Copernicus does assume the circular motion. So he, like Ptolemy, actually needed epicycles to match observed motion, and the math doesn't work. So this is a real problem for Copernicus. So he's saying this is a simpler system. He's saying this is the way things really are, but his math doesn't work. And so because of this, he's actually unable to verify the predictions that he's making, and he's unable to make predictions that are accurate. So Ptolemy's system is actually far more accurate despite being fundamentally incorrect in this early stage. So what we see instead is Copernicus's argument is much more this, what comes to be called a philosophical argument, a rational argument, an intellectual argument, as opposed to being something that is observable and is provable. So this is a big thing that we'll see with the Enlightenment. It's all about being able to prove these claims to be true. And this is something that Copernicus, with his system, is unable to do. I'll take future scholars, future thinkers, we'll talk about next time, to actually make the system work. That said, the impact of Copernicus is absolutely huge. So he is the earliest embrace of a heliocentric system that we see in the Renaissance. And it does reimagine humanity's place in the universe. We're decentered. We're no longer at the exact center of the universe. We're just one planet more. And in doing so, he sets forth his challenge, not just to the church and scripture, but also to all accepted and received authority. So this is what the powers that be, what the intellectual powers to be have been saying for centuries. And Copernicus, in setting forth this system with the sun here at the middle, is laying forth this new idea that challenges not just the church, but also all these established authorities who have been pushing this system for centuries. All right, folks, now that's it. So to recap, we talked about the history of astronomy. We looked at this Ptolemaic system. We talked a bit about the medieval worldview and cosmos. And then we focused in and talked about Copernicus and his great work, The Revolution of the Celestial Orbs. All right, folks, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. And I look forward to continuing our conversation when we talk about Galileo and also Newton for next time. All right, folks, that's it. Take care.